Good evening. I guess it is 6:30. You have to forgive me. I can maybe take a deep breath now. I just came out of a missions committee, so I just run from one thing to the next, and so I'm still trying to catch my breath. It's good to see everybody this evening. We are going to continue and conclude. We're going to do both tonight. Our study of Gideon and his life and what that looked like and what that means for us and what can we learn from the life of Gideon. Before we start, is there somebody in the room that would be willing to open us with a word of prayer? Do you mind, Bill?
Not at all. Let's pray together. Heavenly Father, we come today to worship you and to learn more about your word. Bless Aaron as he speaks. Thank you for the opportunity to hear. May, Lord, our ears be open to hear the message you have for us today and the lesson from Gideon. For Christ's sake, amen.
Amen. Let me grab an outline for myself real quick. Some of you actually gave you the paper backwards. The map is the back part of the paper. I don't know why I handed them out upside down, but I did to half of the room. I apologize for that. So tonight's going to be a little bit interesting because, the title of the last 2 weeks has been Called and Faithful, and that is still going to kind of be the same tonight, but you'll also see that we're going to take a real drastic turn as well. At the top of the paper, I'm just going to read it. Forgive me, I know you can all read. But it says, the end of Gideon's life serves as a reminder that the work is not done until you are removed from the work. 1 Corinthians 10:12 says, let him who thinks he stands take heed that he does not fall. Or if we put that another way, if you think you're standing firm, be careful that you don't fall. And we're going to learn what that means specific to the life of Gideon. Because God wants all of us as followers of Christ to finish well. And Gideon's life actually serves as an example of obedience. We've read and listened to that the last 2 weeks, that his life serves as an example of obedience. But today we're going to learn that it also serves as a warning that we need to finish well. And if you read the next line there, you'll see why tonight will be a little different. Gideon was called and faithful-ish. We're going to talk about the ish tonight. What does that mean and what does that look like? So we're going to be in chapter 8 of Judges, but we're actually going to back up a little bit into chapter 7. Andrew ended on some of this last week at the very end, but we're going to back up a little bit to Judges 7:23, and we're going to pick up right there. So we're going to start with Judges 7:23 through 8:3. And it says, and the men of Israel were summoned from Naphtali, Asher, and all Manasseh, and they pursued Midian. Then Gideon sent messengers throughout the hill country of Ephraim, saying, come down against Midian and take control of the waters ahead of them, as far as Beth-barah and the Jordan. So all the men of Ephraim were summoned, and they took control of the waters as far as Beth-barah and the Jordan, and they captured the two leaders of Midian, Oreb and Zeb. And they killed Oreb at the rock of Oreb, and they killed Zeb at the winepress of Zeb, while they pursued Midian, and they brought the heads of Oreb and Zeb to Gideon from across the Jordan. Chapter 8. Then the men of Ephraim said to Gideon, what is this thing that you have done to us, not calling upon us when you went to fight against Midian? And they quarreled with him vehemently. But he said to them, what have I done now in comparison with you? Is the gleaning of the grapes of Ephraim not better than the vintage of Abiezer? God has handed over to you the leaders of Midian, Oreb, and Zeb. And what was I able to do in comparison with you? Then their anger toward him subsided when he said that. So the first thing that I want to point out is this is actually just after the beginning of the turn for Gideon here. You're going to notice that from here on out, God really isn't a part of any of the activity, at least not that we're told in Scripture here. There's no recording of God saying, do this, or the Spirit of the Lord moving in Gideon to do something. You won't see it. And one of the interesting things is if you the last time, if you go back to chapter 7, is the last time you actually see the Lord did something. In chapter 7, I believe it's verses 9 through 14, the Lord tells Gideon, he said, if you need more confirmation, arise, go down to the camp and see what you'll hear. And he goes down, he hears about the dream and somebody interpreting it. I think it's wild that one of the Midianites says, oh, that means that Gideon's going to defeat us. If I'm that Midianite, I'm packing up and I'm leaving. If I just interpreted the dream that we're about to be conquered. But that's the last time that you actually will read about God moving and doing something in the activity of what Gideon does. And on top of that, I find it very interesting in chapter 7, verse 18. I don't know your translation, but what does the last line say in verse 18, if yours is the same translation? What's the last line? Isn't that interesting? What has Gideon got to do with any of this? And that, in my opinion, is the turn for Gideon. That's when he starts going and veering off course. Because none of this was Gideon's plan. Where was Gideon in the beginning of the story? Hiding. And who called him out? The Lord did. And so this is a story of the Lord and how he used Gideon. And so I find it interesting in chapter 7 there, all of a sudden Gideon saying, oh yeah, shout out for the Lord and for Gideon. Throw me in there too. And you'll notice that he does reference the Lord one other time, but he doesn't even go back to talking about the Lord again as we get into chapter 8 here. And so one of the interesting things too is how many people did God call to go fight the Midianites? 300 people. So they did their responsibility, right? They had their torches, they had their jars. The Midianites started to slaughter one another, and then they began to flee. And so at this moment, Gideon feels the need to now call in men of Naphtali, Asher, and Manasseh. Now, perhaps he was just being a good general and thinking, hey, we've started it, let's bring in the reserves to help finish this thing off. I mean, that is an idea. Maybe that is what he did. But there's another idea of, did the Lord ask him to do that? If the Lord can use 300 to take on 120,000, do you think he really needed those other 22,000 to help finish off what was left? My inclination is no. My inclination that this is Gideon showing that he is starting to veer off course, and instead of doing things in the power of the Lord, he begins to rely more on himself. And that's part of the lesson for us tonight, is that as we walk in our faith, do we rely on the power of the Lord, or will we rely on our own strength? So he calls these tribes back. Sorry, checking on my notes. He called these tribes back, and then he calls another tribe, doesn't he? He sends messengers throughout the hill country of Ephraim. And it's interesting because they weren't even a part of the original 30,000. Those other three, those tribes were at least included in that original 30,000 that the Lord dwindled down to 300. So in some ways it makes a little bit of sense. You could argue that he was being that good general. He sent all the reserves home, and now he's calling them back in. But now he calls in another tribe, the Ephraim, which weren't even a part of the original plan to begin with. And so, again, this is showing that he is beginning to operate in his own capacities and his own thinking and trying to operate out of his own strengths and power. And so when we get to chapter 8 right here, the Ephraim, they killed Oreb, they killed Zeb, and they brought the heads of them to Gideon from across the Jordan. And they come up to him and they say, "What is this thing that you have done to us?" Well, what did Gideon do to them? He didn't include them from the beginning. So how many of you know somebody, you don't have to name any names, how many of you know somebody that when something happens and they're left out, they take offense to that thing that they got left out on? You've never been, I know nobody here's ever been that person, but have you ever known that person? When I read this, that's what I read. They're like, wait a minute, you did this great thing. Instead of celebrating, instead of rejoicing what the Lord did through Gideon in an army of 300, they say, well, you didn't invite us to the dance. Like, what is up with that? So instead of rejoicing in what the Lord had done, they began to say, well, we wanted to be a part of it. And I understand a part of that, and in my fleshiness, I understand part of that. It's nice to be included, right? But that wasn't necessarily the Lord's plan in this particular case, in this particular instance. That's very possible. We're not going to get there tonight, but the Ephraim actually are kind of a pain in the neck anyway. Like if you skip ahead to chapter 12, you'll see that they just like to be defiant. They just kind of like to be obtuse and difficult. So I can say this because I am one. It's kind of like the middle child of the family. We like to be difficult for no reason other than we can because we're the middle child. You know, that's what the Ephraim are. They're just kind of obtuse and difficult for no reason, most of the time other than they can be. And when we talk about them here, I also find it interesting Gideon's response to them. I mean, when you read that the first time, does that make a lick of sense to you? Gideon says to them, "What have I done now in comparison with you? Is the gleaning of the grapes of Ephraim not better than the vintage of Abiezer?" Any agriculturists in here? Anybody here that can? I did study it, but I'm wondering if that makes it, when you just read that, does that make any sense to you? Because essentially what he is saying is, gleaning is when you come in after it's the leftovers. So the harvest, the vintage, the Abiezer, his tribe, they went through and they took all the harvest. And the gleaning is the little bit that's left over. And in my mind, I would actually kind of be offended if that was how they talked to me. If you go, I think it's in Leviticus 19, it talks about how the gleaning is left for the foreigners and the strangers. It's like, you get the leftovers because you're on the outside. So I actually find it ironic that this satisfied them because I would have been offended.
He's saying the leftovers you got are better than everything else.
Yes, because ultimately that's what he's trying to say. He's trying to say that you did get the leftovers, but look at how good they were. You got these two kings or princes or leaders of the Midianites. But in my mind, I'm thinking, is that really what he meant? Was he just trying to pacify them? Was he being diplomatic? Was he being political? And I'm going to talk about those two things now. His response is interesting, and that it could be interpreted one of two ways. One is that he was just being diplomatic. He was saying that what the small army had done and gave paled in comparison to this great act that the Ephraim had just done. They had just killed these two great leaders. So what they had done paled in comparison to what they did in killing these two leaders. But Gideon is also talking about his own people when he talks about, what you did was greater than what we did. In some ways, he's representing his clan. But in some ways, I would almost feel slighted if I'm standing next to him and he's saying, you did all the work. We just did this first thing. I'm like, wait a minute. We just ran off and watched about 120,000 people die. So how can you say that we did very little and that they actually did the biggest thing? But I think he was being either diplomatic, because he overemphasized the mop-up duty, if you will, of what the Ephraimites did, or he was being political. He was practicing political niceties. And what I mean by that is that we know what truth is. All people know what truth is. I hope there's no politicians in the room. How many politicians do you think tell the truth? I'm not saying none because I'm not going to go there, but the reputation is what? The reputation is that they don't tell the truth. They tell partial truths. So there's a chance that he's just being political. After all, what is the greater feat? A tribe of people killing 2 guys or a band of people winning at odds of 450 to 1? Which is really the bigger feat? Yeah, exactly. And God was on which side? The 450 to 1. So really, the bigger feat is accomplished in and through God. And so the bigger feat is actually done with Gideon and his people, but for whatever reason, and I think we'll see part of the reasons here in a little bit, he decided to play political niceties with them and say, oh, you guys are so much better than we are. Because if you notice in his response, he didn't give any credit to who? He gave God 0 credit for everything that just took place. It was either him and his people coming through or the Ephraimites coming back in and wiping out the 2 leaders. So instead of pointing to God as the source of victory from start to finish, Gideon actually appealed to the pride of the Ephraimites instead of the sovereignty of God. And so again, you can begin to see this slippery slope that Gideon is beginning to go down. One commentator that I read noted that Gideon's answer, in this commentator's opinion, was way too soft. This commentator said that Gideon was talking like a politician nearing an election. He is working too hard to appease Ephraim, where rebuke is really what is required. I mean, the Lord just did a miracle. It was miraculous. 450 to 1, and you're victorious. And instead of talking about how great God is and how wonderful of an act he did and how he worked a miracle using your small band of men, instead of pointing to the Lord, he exalts man. And so again, this is that slippery slope that we see Gideon starting down. And I already alluded to this, but this also becomes a source of contention in the future with the Ephraimites because they do kind of become stubborn and obstinate, and they just want to complain because they can complain. It's not really because they want to participate or intend to do anything. They just want to be obstinate. Because one of the central themes of this particular discussion between Gideon and the Ephraimites is who gets the glory. And that's kind of what their whole discussion boils down to. Gideon, from all appearances, appears to be okay with just giving all glory to the Ephraimites, lifting them up because it'll just squelch any kind of confrontation. It'll appease them, and I won't have to deal with any kind of discontent from the Ephraimites. So Ephraim here they're here to seek glory, and like I said, if you skip over to chapter 12 later, you'll see them doing it again. And so one of the questions that comes to mind then is, as a believer, how do we stay mindful to give credit where credit is due? And I don't know if anybody actually wants to give a response to that question or not, but how do we stay mindful to give credit to where credit is due? And an interesting thing is this battle that just took place, the killing of these 2 kings, these 2 leaders, Gideon was just in the winepress like 3 days ago. And he's already, in 3 days, moved past letting God work through him. And now he's exalting men above God, and he's not even mentioning God. 3 days. Now, I don't know about you. I like to think I'm better than 3 days. But how long does it take? How long does it take when the Lord calls you into something and you're doing things and you begin to think, I've got it. I can do this. I know what the next decision needs to be. And before you know it, you're no longer consulting the one who called you to whatever he's called you to. And so that's a question for you to reflect on tonight, is thinking about how long does it take before you stop giving credit where credit is due? Because that's what we're called to do. We're called to worship the Lord our God, first and foremost in all things, in all times, and in all places. And so that should actually always be at the forefront of our minds whenever we're doing something. And in this case, it's just blows my mind because he was called to this days ago, and he's already moved on to thinking that he's got it. And the thing is everybody in this room, we've all done the exact same thing. Every single one of us has gotten to that day, I've got it. Now, I like to think hopefully we all recognized it before something happens, as you will see is what happens with Gideon here. So that brings us to Judges 8:3. Let's go now. We're going to do Judges 8:4 through 21, a long passage here, so hang with me. Then Gideon and 300 men who were with him came to the Jordan and crossed over, weary yet pursuing. He said to the men of Succoth, "Please give loaves of bread to the people who are following me, for they are weary, and I am pursuing Zebah and Zalmunna, the kings of Midian." The leaders of Succoth said, "Are the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna already in your hands, that we should give bread to your army?" Gideon said, "All right, when the Lord has given Zebah and Zalmunna into my hand, then I will thrash your bodies with the thorns of the wilderness and with briars." He went up from there to Penuel and spoke similarly to them. And the men of Penuel answered him, just as the men of Succoth had answered. So he spoke also to the men of Penuel, saying, "When I return safely," or the literal translation of that word is in peace, "when I return in peace, I will tear down this tower." Now Zebah and Zalmunna were in Karkor, and their armies were with them, about 15,000 men, all who were left of the entire army of the sons of the east, for the fallen were 120,000 swordsmen. Gideon went up by the way of those who lived in tents on the east of Nobah and Jogbeha, and attacked the camp when the camp was unsuspecting. When Zebah and Zalmunna fled, he pursued them and captured the two kings of Midian, Zebah and Zalmunna, and routed the whole army. Then Gideon the son of Joash returned from the battle by the ascent of Heres, and he captured a youth from Succoth and questioned him. Then the youth wrote down for him the princes of Succoth and its elders, 77 men. He came to the men of Succoth and said, "Behold, Zebah and Zalmunna, concerning whom you taunted me, saying, 'Are the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna already in your hand, that we should give the bread to your men who are weary?' He took the elders of the city and the thorns of the wilderness and briars, and he disciplined the men of Succoth with them. He tore down the tower of Penuel, and he killed the men of the city. Then he said to Zebah and Zalmunna, 'What kind of men were they whom you killed at Tabor?' And they said, 'They were like you, each one resembling the son of a king.' He said, 'They were my brothers, the sons of my mother. As the Lord lives, if only you had let them live, I would not kill you.' So he said to Jethro's firstborn, 'Rise, kill them.' But the youth did not draw his sword, for he was afraid, because he was still a youth. Then Zebah and Zalmunna said, 'Rise up yourself and fall on us. For as the man, so is his strength.' So Gideon arose and killed Zebah and Zalmunna, and took the crescent ornaments which were on their camels' necks." So I've read that passage like 3 times this week. I did not realize how many times those names repeat over and over and over again. So, I don't even think I told you. So your first outline, did you fill it in? What is it? Are you led by the Spirit of the Lord? Sorry, I forgot that part. Second part, what drives, how's it worded on there? What drives your pursuits? So just a couple of thoughts, just going back to the passage here, and then I'll talk in some specifics. But in verse 7, Gideon says, all right, when the Lord has given Zebah and Zalmunna into my hand. He mentions the Lord. Had he consulted the Lord? Or do we know if the Lord had actually given a directive yet? So how many times have you heard people say, if the Lord wills, or if this happens? One of the things that we have to be careful with is the words that we use. I'm not going to go into a deep dive into it, but there's a difference between God's providence and God's sovereignty. God's providence is his faithful and effective care and guidance of everything which he has made toward the end which he has chosen. So providence means all things will come to the conclusion that God has destined. Sovereignty means that all things are under God's rule, and nothing happens if he either doesn't cause it or permit it. So just because something is permitted, does it necessarily mean that that's the Lord's will, or he permitted it to happen? Some people would say, well, that's semantics and we're splitting hairs. But we need to be careful with the words that we use, because Gideon is assuming, because he said, when the Lord has given, that just because it happened, that the Lord wanted it to happen that way. And so we have to be careful with the words that we choose. And then after that, I find it interesting, again, he didn't, at least in the text, he didn't consult the Lord didn't give a directive. And when we read on, it says, then who will thrash them? I, Gideon. So he's saying, I'm the one in charge here. I will thrash you. And then when he comes down to the people at Penuel, he says, when I return safely, I will tear down this tower. So it's just this theme that you can see him, what appears to be continually moving away from possibly what the Lord actually wanted him to do. And this is the part I've already mentioned. Like, you don't see God mentioned anymore as an active part of the story. You just see Gideon acting, reacting, and the consequences that come from that. It appears to me that Gideon, more than anything, is exuding anger as he seeks his moment to capture and kill a king. So if you go back, he appeased the Ephraimites, saying, oh, you are greater than we are. How many generals want to say that somebody is greater than them and stay satisfied with that? Not very many. If you're the general and you told somebody that's greater than you, now what do you have to do to now get over them? And so I believe that that's part of what is motivating him as he's chasing them. This is part. There's another part we're going to read or talk about here in a second. But I think that he is seeking his moment to capture and to kill. A lot of right. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Exactly right. And because the question is Chip and I were talking about this earlier today. The question is in chapter 8, do we give Gideon the benefit of the doubt or not that he's doing it in the way that God wanted him to do it? And part of the reason I say that is because of how he treats his fellow countrymen in the course of all this action. And so, Stacy, you're exactly right. The Lord said, this is what's going to happen. And it happens. You just wonder, was he motivated because that's what he knew that's what the Lord wanted to do? Was he motivated by other things? I lean a little bit towards he was motivated by some other things. And I'll talk about that here in just a second because it was in this passage that I just read to us. But from an outside observer, it seems like there's this guy on a frantic pursuit to capture these two people at all costs. If you flip your thing over to the map. I tried in black and white. It was impossible to tell, so you got color. So there's the red circle. That's where Gideon's 300 did their part with the big army. And then you see that solid black line. That's initially the Midianites running, and then that's Gideon pursuing. They come all the way down to Beth Barah, which is where Ephraim did their part with their 2 leaders. And then they have to cross over to get to these other 2 cities. From Herod's Well, which is where the 300 fought to begin with, to Succoth this was me measuring on a computer screen using their little key. But it was about 35 miles. So can you imagine that? He's so bent on catching them that they have traveled 35 miles at a rapid pace in hot pursuit. I can't even really imagine walking 35 miles today, let alone hot pursuit of somebody trying to catch them. And part of it, like Stacy said, part of the motivation might have been he knew what the end objective was supposed to be: kill all the Midianites. Part of his thinking, because he has a fallible person, was a fallible person just like all of us. So there may have been other parts of him thinking, but I need to one up what's already been done. So it could be a combination of things. Part of this isn't written, part of this is reading text and trying to interpret and understand. And so as we see him frantically pursuing them, he comes upon these 2 cities, and he stops and he asks for aid. And the response to both in both places was the same. It was no, not going to do it. And at first you think, that's crazy. Why would you not help Gideon finish these guys off? So this next part, I don't know. This is part my imagination. If you live 35 miles from somewhere and you need to travel by foot or possibly by horse or donkey, what are the odds you even know what has even happened in the past 2 days? I'm not saying impossible, but I'm thinking maybe they don't even know what's going on. Or they just watched 15,000 men retreating, this merry band of 300 behind them. And they're saying, give us bread and sustenance so that we can go pursue them. And you're thinking, if you fail, they're going to come back. And they're not going to be very nice to us if we gave you aid. So you also have to think, I would imagine that's part of the thinking that's going on in the minds of these people in these 2 cities of, why would we do that? There's no way, because again, they didn't witness this other great battle. All they see is what's before them, and they say, well, I really don't like your odds, and I'd rather remain, if anything, neutral than pick a side, even though ultimately they do pick a side. If you don't help, then you're helping the other side. But what's interesting is Gideon's response to them. He's kind of moved from a leader who's trying to lead well and understand and fulfill his mission, because to me, his response seems a little out of hand. It seems a little overboard. You're not going to give me bread? I'm going to come back here and I'm going to basically make a switch of briars and thistles, and I'm going to discipline you with it. That seems kind of harsh for somebody saying, I'm not going to give you bread. I understand why he would be mad. You just ran 35 miles. I could only imagine how hungry and tired and weary you are. But his response seems a little overboard. And then not only that, but then he goes to the next city and he threatens to tear down their tower. And their tower would have been like their primary mode of defense. It's how they keep their people safe. He says, I'm going to come back down and I'm going to tear that baby down when we come back. So he continues on. He gets the 2 kings, and he makes good on his promises. He comes back to these 2 cities. He disciplines the one. Depending on exactly what the tool was, it was either a switch made out of briars and thistles, or they also had these things that kind of looks like a wooden sled, and on the bottom of it had all these sharp edges that they would run over grain to help separate. So he was either whipping them or he was dragging this thing over them. No matter what it wasn't pleasant, and it couldn't have felt good. And then he went to Penuel. He tore down their tower. And then beyond that, he did even worse than he had threatened when he passed through the first time. He turns around and he kills all of the men. So it's interesting to see this change in Gideon. In chapter 6, he's scared, hiding in a wine press. 7, he appears faithful, he's confident, he's obedient. And then you move into chapter 8, and he's still fulfilling that mandate to wipe out the Midianites, but he almost comes off as somebody who's like stuck in anger and vengeance mode. Because the Ephraimites, yes, they killed 2 leaders, so they helped. But his response to them was so much different than the people in Succoth and Penuel. These are his people. These are Israelites. I'm not saying I would do any better. I'm not suggesting that. But you would think, family, would you not extend a little grace? Maybe a little understanding? Or maybe if you're making noises, perhaps that's a reflection of the family you're from, and you wouldn't do that. I don't know. Some of us have some of those family members too. But when you think about it, why would he deal with them so harshly? Why did he treat his fellow Israelites as if they were also enemies? I mean, there is the argument that in not helping them, they inadvertently helped the enemy. There's an argument there. But you wonder how he went from hiding in a wine press to willing to beat and murder fellow Israelites. Some kind of change has happened. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think part of it, too, is found in verses 18 through 21. You know, he does these atrocities in these cities, and then he's got these 2 kings. And he asks the kings a question. He says, who were the men whom you killed in Tabor? So there was a battle that took place in another place, and another time. These guys were, if they weren't the kings, they were leaders, prominent people of the Midianite army, and they killed people. If you go back to, I think it's in chapter 6, it talks about how Gideon is Joash's youngest son. And so when he asks this question, it's actually a loaded question that he's asking them, because I think he already knows what the answer is. And so when they respond to him, I don't know if they're mocking him or if they're trying to butter him up, because their response is, oh, you and they were alike, each one resembling the son of a king. So I don't know if they were trying to butter him up as if maybe he'd go easier on them, or if they also knew and they were mocking him. Because his response is, those men were my brothers. So when you learn that little piece, yes, the Midianites are slowly getting wiped out, but then you think, so what is actually motivating Gideon? Is it the initial mandate to go out and wipe out? Or is there some revenge that's also taking place in here? So his response was that they were his brothers. So that at least reveals part. I believe, knowing how people work, I believe that at least really reveals part of his motivation was revenge. And then he tells the kings, which is kind of odd, because going back to Stacy's point, God said to do what to all the Midianites? But then right here he says, if you had let my brothers live, I would not kill you. So you can see a struggle that Gideon is having. And even more interesting is, it seems like he's not really carrying out God's mission anymore. It's maybe turned into his own vendetta instead. And then he goes on and he asks his son to kill them. Now, most of us in this room would think that's terrible. You know, my son is 17. We're in battle, like, son, You get to do it. Take them out. If you know my son, he would, number one, probably wouldn't be anywhere near the battle. And if I handed him a sword and told him to kill somebody, he would probably drop it and run. But you have to think of the time period. You have to think of what life was like. It was the establishing of I am Gideon. I am the one who is getting this done. And you as my son have the opportunity to basically come behind me. But his son could not do it, which is a perfect reflection of Gideon not 3 or 4 days before, hiding in a wine press, scared to do it, and his son is right there with him saying, I can't do that. And in the same way, these two kings talk again, and again, I don't know if they're mocking him or if they're speaking truth to him. They say in there, let me find it, rise up yourself and attack us, for as the man, so is his strength. So I don't know if they're saying, no, if you're a real man, you'd get up and do it yourself. I mean, when I hear it, that's kind of what I hear. It's almost like, I bet you're having this boy do it because you can't do it yourself. And then Gideon rises, and he kills them both. And then the next part, I think, really just makes his downward fall just go double speed. He stands up, and he takes the crescent amulets which were on the camels' necks. So when you take those are ornaments of a king. And we're going to talk about what that looks like in the next section here. But these two events, being compared to royalty, these two kings, whether it was mocking or flattery, they said he had the appearance of the son of a king. And then he took these crescent ornaments. And these two things really begin his rapid descent down the other side of this slippery slope. It takes Gideon and ultimately it takes Israel in the wrong direction. So that takes us to the last part of our section here, Judges 8:22 through 35. It says, Then the men of Israel said to Gideon, Rule over us, both you and your son, also your son's son, for you have delivered us from the hand of Midian. But Gideon said to them, I will not rule over you, nor shall my son rule over you. The Lord shall rule over you. Yet Gideon said to them, I would request of you that each of you give me an earring from his spoil. For they had gold earrings because they were Ishmaelites. They said, We will surely give them. So they spread out a garment, every one of them threw an earring there from his spoil. The weight of the gold earrings they requested was 1,700 shekels of gold, besides the crescent ornaments and the pendants and the purple robes which were on the kings of Midian, and besides the neck bands that were on their camels' necks. Did you catch all the stuff that he just gained right there? That's a lot of stuff. Gideon made it into an ephod and placed it in his city, in Ophrah. And Israel played the harlot with it there, so that it became a snare to Gideon and his household. So Midian was subdued before the sons of Israel, and they did not lift up their heads any more. And the land was undisturbed for 40 years in the days of Gideon. Then Jerubbaal, the son of Joash, went and lived in his own house. Now Gideon had 70 sons who were his direct descendants, for he had many wives. His concubine, who was in Shechem, also bore him a son, and he named him Abimelech. And Gideon, the son of Joash, died at a ripe old age and was buried in the tomb of his father Joash in Ophrah of the Abiezrites. Then it came about, as soon as Gideon was dead, that the sons of Israel again played the harlot with the Baals, and Baal beareth their God. Thus the sons of Israel did not remember the Lord their God, who had delivered them from the hands of all their enemies on every side, nor did they show kindness to the household of Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, in accord with all the good that he had done to Israel. So the third part on the outline is, what will be your legacy? What will be your legacy? So the Israelites recognized that Gideon's actions, that him being called royalty or considered royalty, and the taking of these two ornaments, they recognized those actions for what they were, and they said, we would like to ask you to rule over us. They noted that Gideon had delivered them from the power of Midian. The Lord's work in providing Gideon is already being forgotten and overlooked. So the Lord is already, I don't even know if he's in the back seat. I don't even know if he's in the car anymore. Like, they have pushed the Lord so far out of everything except for one line. We will give Gideon credit on one little thing he did, but we will see that I think it was just for face value. Gideon's response was actually the correct thing to say. He said, "The Lord will rule over you." And you would think, oh, he's going to end well. He did it right. He recognizes that the Lord should be the one ruling over, and he's going to get it right. But he did not correct the idea that he was the one that saved them. Let me go back and find it in here. They said, "Rule over us, for you have saved us." And he said, "I'm not going to rule over you. The Lord will rule over you." But did he say that it was the Lord who saved them? Mm-hmm. So Gideon, in spite of turning down their offer to rule over them, if you look at his actions, his actions speak louder than his words. He said, "No, the Lord rule over you." But then he says, "But give me some of the spoils." He asked what would be considered a royal share of the plunder. Everyone gave a gold earring, and that represented a symbolic token of submission to him. He's not king, but he's saying, you are still going to be submissive to me. I want all of you to give me a gold earring. Gideon then used those earrings, and what did he do with it? He made an ephod. He made an idol. Now, an ephod normally is known as like this garment that's worn typically by the Levitical priests, and they would use it. I can't explain it to you. Don't ask me to explain it to you. But they would use it as a way to determine what God's will was for the people. There's this thing about the Bible that's called the mysteries of God. There are some of them we will never understand. So he makes this thing. Now, ephods were supposed to be worn by priests who were part of whose tribe? I just said it. The Levites. Is he a Levite? No. So he's stepping out of order now, correct? He's not a Levite, but he's going to go ahead and do it. Maybe it's partly to glorify himself. Maybe he's hoping that if he does it and he uses it correctly, then he can kind of be in that place of a priest. Whatever his ultimate motivation is kind of irrelevant, because what it does is it ensnares Gideon, it ensnares his family, and in the end it ensnares all of Israel to chase after false gods. And the interesting thing too is he sets up this ephod, this idol, in Ophrah. Does that city ring a bell to anybody? Where was the wine press? It was his hometown. It's where the story started. Chapter 6, he tore down the altars to Baal and the Asherah. The end of chapter 8, he sets up an idol. So tell me, is Israel better off than they were before? In some ways, they're worse off because it was their own people that created and placed the idol in their place amongst them. So in the ancient Near East, this part of the world, during this time epic, this time period, kings would have usually at least the following, if not more. Kings would have bequests from their vassals, or they would have like the earrings that he collected. They would have a royal share of things. So people would give them a royal share, showing that he's king. They're under his submission. They would amass a royal treasury. And the list was, how many things did he get? It weighed 17 shekels of gold. He got crescent amulets, he got ear pendants, and he got purple robes, apart from the neck chains that were also on the camel's necks. So he now has a treasury. These kings in this time period, they would display symbols of royalty, which is the purple robe, and they would establish and maintain harems. How many wives did he have? Just the one? How many wives did he have? And he had at least how many concubines? We know he had at least one. So he said, I will not rule over you, the Lord will rule over you. But when you look at everything he does, if you look at his entire life, what is he doing? He's acting just like a king. Everything he does is exactly what a king of that time period would do. And a very interesting thing is this concubine has a son. And who names the son? Gideon names his son Abimelech. Would you like to guess what the name Abimelech means? Take a wild guess. Son of the king. So this man says, I don't want to rule over you. But if you watch everything he does, he wants all the perks, all the power of being a king. He just doesn't necessarily have the title. And then you get to the end of the chapter here, and really the biggest positive that happens at this point is there's 40 years of rest, which is good because it also says that Midian was subdued. How did it word it in here? They did not lift up their heads anymore. It's a nice way of saying they didn't come out of the grave, but they were subdued. So in a way, Gideon accomplished his mission, but in a way, he screwed it all up along the way. So they did get 40 years of peace, or of rest. You can check me on it later if you want, but I'm pretty certain that this is the last time in the book of Judges it says the people of Israel have rest. It doesn't happen again. The last time it happens is with Gideon, and Gideon messes up a lot of things to get him there. And as Gideon died, his family's there, and what does it say? How did they treat his family? They did not show kindness to his household in accordance with all the good that Gideon had done. So in a lot of ways, the same way that Israel constantly has rejected God over and over and over again, they rejected Gideon and his family just the same. So when you think of that, you know, the title or the heading for this part was, what will be your legacy? When you read Gideon, if you read all 3 chapters and you read his whole story, I mean, he starts off kind of like probably all of us would be. He becomes this great leader, but then look at his legacy. How does it end? In a lot of ways, Israel is worse off having him led than had he not been raised up as a judge. Now, that doesn't mean he wasn't supposed to be. The Lord called him, and the Lord accomplished purposes that he needed accomplished. But when you step back and you look at the big picture, Israel in a lot of ways is worse off than before. Not only did he set up an idol that ensnared them all, when he died, they just went right back worshiping Baal again. I should have written down who said this, but I wrote down a quote here. Anytime we do anything for the Lord works through us, and people see that the Lord is working in a good way. This is a note of warning for us. This is a quote. It says, "It is ever our danger that after being used by God in some way, that we mouth humility, but we practice pride. We may know occasions of the Spirit's power, and yet lack the Spirit's wisdom." So part of tonight is to understand that our faith walk is a marathon. It's not a sprint. If you sprint out of the blocks in a marathon, you don't make it very far. How many people anybody in here ever ran a marathon? Oh, look at it. We got 5 of us. So, David, how much of it did you sprint? Jaime, how much of it did you sprint? Melissa? Karen? Just the finish line. The best part to sprint over, right? We know the end is here. We can sprint now. Our faith is meant to be the marathon, not the sprint. One of the things that Gideon did, he took his eyes off the Lord. He did not continue to follow the Lord's directive and leading, and his journey took him way off course. It's like on a marathon. It's marked. You do not want to be the person that misses the turn and you go off course. But that's exactly what Gideon did. He missed the turn and he went way off course. Doing work for the kingdom is a wonderful thing, but we have to guard ourselves against the pride that can come that somehow it was me that did it and not the Lord. So that's, I think, what was ultimately Gideon's downfall, is he let pride consume him, and he did not end well. So my word of encouragement, my charge for the night is end well. End well. Any questions, any comments, any afterthoughts?
He said, the Lord's going to rule over you, but in case I'm the Ephod of the priest,
Mm-hmm.
I will tell you what God wants to do.
Yeah.
So, if it's not me, it's the Lord, but this is what I say. And that's the real trap anytime.
Mm-hmm.
We see big preachers fall and that kind of
Yeah.
thing. But that was also, if my theology is right about Satan, he was the one that received the glory. He was the one that did all that thing for God, and then finally one day he said, it's mine, and the pride of his
The pride before the fall, right?
destruction.
Yeah.
Oh, he's spirit before the fall.
Destruction,
Pride
yes.
before destruction.
Thank you, Bill. Any other parting words, questions?
I think it's important to know this is where Oprah Winfrey got her name. Her mom said she misspelled it because she could go check the Bible and go to the hospital.
There you go. So Chip's got your trivia fact if you need to write that down for future reference. All right, well, let's end this way. I think, Bill, if you just want to move up one table or over one table, I'll ask you guys as a table, share prayer requests that you have, pray for one another, and when your table is done praying, we are all done for the night. So just circle up somewhere and lift up some prayer requests on each other's behalf.